Thank you. So we've got this last session, this very interesting session. What are the implications for practice? And we've got three people who are going to speak for 10 minutes each, or roughly there. So we've got Richard Field, Jane Delicott, who are both foster carers, and then Robert Tapsfield from the Fostering Network. We're really looking forward to what you've all got to say, and we're going to start with Richard.
Hi, I feel incredibly privileged to be here amongst the people I desperately want to talk to. But we've talked in our group about lots of things, and I've put down a few notes, but as the day went on, the notes got bigger and bigger, and I've got pages of scribbles, so I hope I make some sense. I've just put some vague headings, and I'm going to talk around them. One of the ones I put down is contacts. We talked a bit about the role of contact in all of this, and the importance of attachments, secure bases, etc. And I thought contacts are complicated because it's the one time where the child goes back to the parent, and often the aim is to get the child home, and yet the contact possibly is a very underused role. Contact can often fail. There can often be, in my experience, different contact workers with children, sometimes not very healthy relationships, quite collusive between parent and contact worker. Often contact itself can be quite damaging, and it's sometimes hard to change. The decisions, often courts are involved, so it is hard to change decisions that have been made that everyone quite thinks actually a negative relationship. There's also the whole point that the relationship that the parent had with their child wasn't healthy, that's why they're in care. And yet you see this child in a kind of very positive snapshot. And it's almost like you're creating this false attachment with this parent, and the child's memory of their parent and their experiences of contact can be very different, and how healthy that is actually in long term. And the child's looking back, why am I in care? Because I used to spend lovely time with my mum. And actually, sometimes, maybe the honesty, maybe we need to think about how we construct that and what the child finds out. And I think that's an interesting one. I'm going to jump onto autonomy, because that was very interesting as well. We had some really interesting debates about autonomy, because you're giving autonomy to these teenagers, and teenagers need autonomy as they come into teenage years. Except these aren't your typical teenagers. They've had quite negative early attachments. So are they quite ready for the level of autonomy a typical teenager might have? You've got a real balance between autonomy and need for secure base and attachment. So it's quite a complicated area, and how we begin to let that go, and the balance of autonomy in relation to, I wrote something really sort of sensible earlier, and I can't remember. But Gillian talked a lot about the secure base. And when there you go, dependency relationship. When you've got a dependent relationship, quite dependent actually in a lot of ways, and you're expected to be dependent because you've got social workers on your back telling you you've got to do this, you've got to do that, you can't do this, you can't do that, you've got to tell so-and-so happens. So it's quite a lot to juggle. But I think that the autonomy will come out of that dependable relationship, so you do need to have quite a dependency with them, and gradually autonomy will emerge. But it is complicated, and of course, and that brought me again to, it was Francis, I think, did a little pyramid based on the Webster Stratton stuff, and at the top of it was consequences. And I'm thinking about, as a foster carer, who's in charge of those consequences? How much autonomy do I have to implement certain consequences? And that child knows damn well that I can't remove their pocket money, I probably can't take their phone. There's various things that I've got to check with people to do, and it's very difficult because the top of that triangle, which is so crucial to the good parenting relationships, it's very hard to know who's there and how I sit there as a foster care in relation to all the other people involved with me. So that's definitely a complicated one to think about, which leads me on to think about support as a whole. You know, working with families and supporting foster families is desperately important, as a lot of stuff Francis was talking about, the relationships, the family work. Supervision. I'm supervised by a social worker from the local authority who wants to safeguard that child, who's worried about litigation and allegations and all sorts of stuff. Conflict of interest, for me, I feel immense. I'm not sure, personally, that a social worker from the organisation you foster for can supervise you effectively. Not saying that that's not... No, they can do very effective supervision. They may not be able to meet your needs as a carer to enable you to meet the needs of the child. There's things you need to talk about very openly without worrying about litigation or allegations or crossing boundaries, and that's something I think we need to seriously think about, is who provides supervision. And also, a a lot of these social workers get there by default through their position. Not necessarily. I've spoken to many supervising social workers who haven't been given any additional training around what supervision is and what that means. And some of them are fantastic, some not so. And I hear lots of horror stories from the foster carers. And I think that needs to be thought about. Education and social care. A big thing for me because I work in education. And I've heard both mentioned today, but very much going down social care route most of the time. And the virtual head role is so exciting because it's something we need to really think about, how that virtual head pulls us together and how that role links up. I work for City of Westminster in my day job in a tri-borough children's service now. We've all amalgamated. And I know in those 3 boroughs they're amalgamating the virtual head, but all of them work very, very differently under very, very different models. And there's kind of a bit of fighting for what's going to be the ultimate model for the tri-borough. I know in the authority that I foster for, I've never been contacted by a virtual head in the last 2.5 years. Don't even know who it is, couldn't find the website. It's such a crucial role and it needs to pull social care and education together. I think it's been written down, it's what people were talking about earlier, about policy and practice kind of map. I think that's something we need to all push for and start linking things together more, because education, these children spend so much time at their schools and it's one of the real consistent things alongside this. That's another thing, I didn't even discuss with my group because we got caught up in other things, but I'm very aware, having a child on the border of teenage, just about to turn 13, that the term, we're talking a lot today about family, about carer, about relationships in a family. My just about to turn 13-year-old really freaks out if someone uses the word family or parent or anything like that about him and me. And I think we need to be very careful with teenagers in foster care about the terms and the language we use, because whilst we know what family means and we know what we're all talking about is a kind of positive family type relationship, if we start throwing around these names, dad, mum, family, about the child in this, particularly when they come into, what was the term? There was a graduating adolescent and something else adolescent. Entrant, that's it. Entrant. For entrant adolescence. I like those terms. For entrant adolescent, someone who's coming into care at an adolescent age, we've got to be very careful about the language we use, because it freaks the children out and barriers can go straight up. I'm going to stop.
That's great. Thank you, Richard. Jane.
Hi. Sorry, you don't mind if I stand up, do you? It sort of makes me feel more confident. Okay. What I wanted to start by saying was thanks for inviting us here today, Judy, and all this organisation, everybody involved. There's absolutely no doubt that there's a huge body of good intention behind getting best outcomes for young people in care, and the amount of research is absolutely awesome. I didn't know anything about the research when I entered fostering. It was just, I just thought I'd have a look at it because I had a few spare rooms and I like young people. And I guess one thing for me is the word disconnect came up somewhere, a little bit of a gap between all this huge body of research, all this professionalism and the practitioners. On the ground it does look very different, whether you're looking sort of bottom up or top down, I have to say. So this is very interesting to fill in gaps for me. But I really do think we need to make sure that the academics, professionals and the practitioners work extremely closely together. Where that happens in practice, it's really helpful. So for me, for example, where I have a lot of support from my agency, I work closely with professionals within the school, I've got some therapist help on board and so on with my placements. It makes all of the difference, particularly because if you are transparent with children and you tell them what you're doing and who you are working with, they understand it's a team effort and what's going into their future and that they are part of it. Because I think sometimes children sit at a table with 6 or 8 professionals and they think, what am I doing here? You know, who are these strangers? They always bring a briefcase, they flip out great big philo faxes, everything's going on around them. And it's extremely hard environment for a young person to put their point of view forward. I know that review documents are sent out before the looked after reviews, but actually kids find it hard to say what they want to say in the 5 seconds that they get to put down their feelings. So that's a gap we could close. And maybe, for example, before a looked after review, or child looked after, whichever way around it is now, maybe the school should be the people who very much spend time over a period of time gathering their views rather than slapping something out before them, you know, a day or two before to make sure you've done the bit of paperwork you should have done before the review meeting. There must be best practice that we can now, you know, we talked about it today, that could be encapsulated. I think that there should be some uniformity right across all the providers of care for young people, because I know, again from experience, that according to the local authority, the placement I've got has been sent to me, you know, from, will make a difference to their experience in the amount of contact that they have with their social worker, in holiday activities which are on offer, participation groups run by some local authorities for young people and not for others, so on and so on. Real practical things which are different. Things like a leisure card with money on. One of my kids gets that, the other one doesn't. What's that about? How fair is that? You know, they don't, that's what they care about. Why does he get that and I don't? It really should be an equal provision, and in terms of the pupil premium, I believe that should track with the child and should be fair, and each child should know what is being spent on them. You know, you got that because, you know, then they do feel supported if they know money's actually been spent on them. In terms of actual practical things, as a carer, I think you should make firm decisions. That's part way between adequate and coercive, okay? Sometimes I'm coercive, even if I shouldn't be, but then you have to make your decisions, but you should always give reasons, and you need to give reasons within the context of the child. So I can't let you have internet access when I'm not in the house, because when you did have, and that happened, I was worried for your safety, and look what happened because of that. Then they understand you're not just being horrid, you are actually giving firm reasons that pertain to their safety and general well-being in their lives. But be transparent. That's what I would always say to any foster carer. Discuss absolutely everything. Don't say anything to, well, okay, nearly everything you say to a social worker, you should be able to say to that child directly, because actually they're the one that knows. How many minutes have I got? 1 minute?
No, yeah.
Okay.
Another minute, a few minutes, yeah.
There is a disconnect between what's ideal and what really happens. When things happen on a Friday evening and a child has to be stuffed into a placement, let's be honest, they're stuffed into a placement because they've got to put their head on a pillow that night. That isn't ideal, but there are many times when a little bit more time, I think, could be taken to match a child properly with a placement, rather than just putting them into one which is available, so that, you know, so that the outcome is better. We talked about attachment, and in our group we felt that the community formed a great part of their attachment as well, so they may attach to a location which is important, to a school which is important, and to their peer group, and if they can attach there, they probably can later on form some sort of good attachments in their personal relationships as well, if you help them build on that, even if they can't really attach to you as foster carers, you know, or professionals. And we did really pick up on the point about step-parenting and how that must probably mirror, to a great extent, what it's like of foster caring, because you're taking on somebody else's children, and that will always be the fact. However much they might want you to be their mummy, you're actually never going to quite be their mummy unless you adopt them. But it's helping young people to feel valid, even though their own parents, for whatever reason, couldn't quite do that job of parenting. Not to make them feel about that, but to help them shed the baggage of that shame, appreciate their parents for who they are, and put it as a okay part of their story, even if they still don't like it. But at the same time, to be able to be part of your extended family. I call my kids my extended family, and my home's their home. Where else have they got? It is their home, isn't it? And so it's giving them that feeling, while not completely dislocating them from their birth family at the same time. And all of it's a totally impossible job, but I think that teamwork really helps.
Thank you very much.
Robert. Yeah, can I go and stand up over here? And I can stand a chance of reading what I've written as well as talking to you, otherwise I can't manage it. Thank you very much. Judy asked me to say something about the policy implications of what's come out of today, so that's what I'm going to try and do. I think first of all, just to say that I was very struck by some of the changes that there have been in the last 10 years. I don't think we mustn't forget. Is that my mobile phone that's causing those troubles? That's not some of the changes that there have been. I was very struck in Gillian's presentation about the role of foster carers. I remember when I arrived at the fostering network, the first time I mentioned love, I was told that I mustn't talk about love and foster care. But we can now talk about love and foster care, and that's important because we didn't used to be able to, actually. That's now a horrifying notion. So we can now talk about that, so that's good. I think the Minister this morning reminded us, actually, what a lot of good policy developments there have been in the last few years. Delegated authority, which is really about the status and role of foster carers, not just about delegated authority, the whole professionalisation shifts, the introduction of evidence-based programmes, and most importantly, and the one we're particularly delighted with, which is that we've managed to persuade them to keep children in foster care until 21. And that, probably more than anything else, is likely to have a big difference, a big impact on outcomes. Of course, as Helen Coates-Brown reminded us in her question, the real challenge often is we may have some good policy, but how it's implemented. And there is a real gap between some of the policy and some of the guidance and what's expected to happen to what actually happens. And young people and foster carers will speak about that and tell us about that every day. And when I was fortunate enough to chair the group of organisations that set up the care inquiry, and I remember very clearly at the first meeting what rang true and true again was people saying if only what had happened had followed what the guidance said should happen, it would have been all right, and it didn't. So there was a real challenge for what on earth we were going to recommend if clearly more policy wasn't the answer. It's how do you make it happen? So I think there's a real challenge still around stability, a lack of consistency and quality in relationships, the access to the specialist help when it's needed, sometimes a lack of ambition for children in foster care, and a real inconsistency in practice. And also the need, as Gillian emphasised, to introduce permanency thinking to our work with teenagers. We do it an awful lot when the children are very young, but it somehow drops off the radar when they're teenagers. And one of the recommendations from the care inquiry, probably one of the most practical recommendations and easiest to get hold of, was that for every child in care, and I think particularly for teenagers, because we probably do it for younger children, we need to ask ourselves at the review, who is going to be there for them when they're 25? Who is there? And if we can't answer that question, then you have a problem and that you need to find that person. And if you can answer that question, then part of your job as a local authority is to strengthen, support and promote that relationship. And I think sometimes what we do is those people do exist, but we casually break or discard the very relationships that might serve people well when they're 25. Even if they're not their foster carer, even if it's someone else who's very important to the child. So nurturing those relationships. So I think that putting it into practice is absolutely critical in terms of a sort of where we need to direct our efforts next. But I want to say something more before I talk about an example of how we're doing that at the Fostering Network and to share with you something. I think there is an issue that if we were to ask ourselves, and you all here are experienced foster carers, practitioners, managers, policymakers, but if I were to ask you, are you satisfied with the overall quality of the foster care workforce? Not the individual quality. We have heard today and met and hear every day of some exceptional foster carers, but are you satisfied with the overall quality? Do you think that's good enough? And do you think the overall quality of the social workforce and the other support workforce that supports foster carers is good enough? And I suspect you would think that we needed to make a step change in the overall quality if we are really going to meet and address the needs of some of the challenging children that are in foster care today. Because let's make no mistake about it, many of the children who come into foster care are going to pose whoever looks after them with an enormous challenge. And to meet that challenge, we need people with enormous levels of skill who are well supported by also highly skilled professionals. So I think we do need to make a step change, and that is a policy imperative as well as a practice imperative in the overall quality of the workforce, and look at what that means for the training and ongoing training and support and our ambition for what happens to foster carers. When one looks at the level of knowledge one expects them to have, the range of skills they're expected, how we can support and enable them, and Richard's talk about the challenges of who supervises you, who can really help you with the reflective practice that you need to bring to the work that you're doing. Foster care starts when good parenting has run out, really, and when good parenting is not enough, and that means that it's going to take a lot of thinking and a lot of hard work. So who is going to really do that, and what are our expectations for foster carers? And also, what are our expectations for the rest of the childcare workforce to make sure they have the skills necessary to support foster carers? And there's an enormous amount we have to do to build that skills and expertise. So that I think the big thing on my agenda is certainly looking at how we can, our ambition for the quality of the workforce as we go forward if we're going to meet the needs of children in foster care. I want to finally say something about something that we're doing at the Fostering Network, which is a programme called Head, Heart, Hands that is introducing social pedagogy into foster care and looking at the contribution that social pedagogy can make to foster care. And I'm not going to give you a lecture now, I haven't got time on social pedagogy. And anyway, I'm not the right person to do that. There are better people to do that. But what really attracted us to it, apart from some of the thinking, was that it actually, we thought, provided a theory of why, a theoretical base for why what foster carers do is work as well as love and care. It's an emotional and something that you do with skill. So it provides a theoretical framework that encompasses that. And the programme that we have that's introducing it in 6 sites in England and Scotland is a 4-year programme, and we're in year 1.5, so it's early days, but beginning to show some really encouraging signs, and the foster carers who are beginning to have completed the 10-day training module with some of the supervising social workers are really positive and encouraged and up for what that's teaching them, and already beginning to see some of the impacts it can make on children. Of course, there's a long way to go, because we have got to show that overall it's going to make a difference to the lives of children. It will be great if it makes a difference to foster carers, but in the end, the only point of doing it if it helps children. But we can see the potential already. But what I think is going to be the biggest challenge is not the training of foster carers, not the giving them of skills that can really make a difference, not even the training of some of their supervising social workers to support them, but can we embed this systemically and culturally? What are the systemic and cultural challenges about how you embed this into practice? And that's going to be the real challenge of how we do that. And an example of that is actually one of the sites, we're really encouraged by this, has now asked us to come and help them think about how they manage allegations, not probably the most serious, but those minor concerns that can so disrupt the lives of foster carers and children. How can they manage those using some of these new ways of thinking in ways that better serve the interests of foster carers and children? And so that will be an issue, really, at the Fostering Network, this is a big issue for us, because we hear how these things go wrong too often and cause pain, suffering and distress to foster carers and children. But it will also be a real challenge to whether, using some of the social pedagogic thinking and framework, we can use that with the authorities to help think about how we can make systemic and cultural changes that protect children and really support and promote them, and strengthen the role of foster carers in supporting and promoting those children. So there will be other ways in which social pedagogy will ask us to think about how we change practice. Not in ways that we don't want to, because we also, I'm waiting now for John to tell me I've got to stop, but we also, we wrote a couple of years ago now, Safer Caring, which had outlived its usefulness. And the older versions of Safer Caring years ago would have said terrible things about the sort of pyjamas you must wear if you're a foster care and other horrors, I suspect. But the new version, we were absolutely committed, must be saying that actually Safer Caring is about building nurturing and protective relationships with children. And any notion that safer caring was about not being able to touch and give children physical affection has to be thrown out of the window. It never said that, but it was taken to believe that. So actually, but that which is absolutely in line with the social pedagogic approach, but that's not why we did it. It's not why we were interested in revising safer caring. It was because it was right and what we wanted to do. And I think that's what we think about social pedagogy. Social pedagogy isn't a magic bullet, but it may well be a framework that helps us to do and to think about and gives a theoretical basis that will help us to do what we know we must do, which is providing more loving, caring, skilled relationships with these very damaged children and really helping to transform their lives. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Richard, Jane and Robert. I mean, a really diverse but very stimulating reflections on the day. Now, Julie's very kindly going to sort of sum up the day, but we've got a few minutes. Is that all right? We've got for 10 minutes or so. So, any questions to any of the three here up on the panel? We've got some very interesting ideas, and I'm sure there are things in your mind. So, any thoughts? Anyone like to pick up some of the? Yes?
Excuse my ignorance, but what is social pedagogy? I've never heard the word.
I'm going to tell you, but it won't help. And actually, if you ask people what social work is, they find it very difficult to explain, but we all know, so we don't ask. But essentially, social pedagogy is about the upbringing in the child. It's about the education of the child in the broadest sense. And it's about how we help children and get alongside them, really, to grow up to be citizens that make a successful contribution to society.
That's very clear, thank you.
You'll be able to ask Robert a bit more later. No? Anyone? Yes?
It's more an observation. We talked a lot about foster care quite rightly. But I was thinking for teenagers, it's a bit about the ones other significant adults who aren't birth family, but other people. But I think it's a bit having that safe space so you can sound off. Not your care, but somebody else. And there's something about having important adults in there for that. It can be a teacher, it can be anybody, a football manager, whatever. But there's something about that I think has been missing.
I think that's really important because normal adolescence involves making relationships with a wider range of adults. And adults, whether they're grandparents or professional teachers or whatever, play a key role. I don't know if either of you want to comment on that. The role of the other
It is
other
interesting
adults.
actually, not necessarily adults, but other children. One of the
Well, other young people as well.
Some of the relationships weren't very appropriate because there hadn't been enough guidance and structure before. Since, I don't know, there's probably different sides of this argument, isn't there? In some ways, sometimes you need to withdraw that, make sure there's some kind of secure base, and then allow them out little bit by little bit. That would be how I work with my young person, because he was in a dodgy space. Yeah. But I'm sure there are different children in different places.
Okay, good. Yes?
Just
thank you.
Anecdotally on that, and John Bowlby, who began all the attachment, I heard him speak just before he died, and from the audience there was this question of, well, how do I know if my kid should see a psychiatrist or psychotherapist or psychologist, or what difference does it make? And his response is, just so long as a child's got at least one interested adult in their life, that's what they need. And it's very much on that flavour that you need an interested adult.
Absolutely. Thank you, Leslie. Anyone? Yeah?
Comment on that last point about other interested people. I think birth family members, particularly teenagers, other teenagers within families, play a very, very important role in that, providing they're well supported. That's important. And the other thing is an observation about Gillian's comment about professionalism in foster care. I know in the Fostering Network we debated a long time around the professional approach to foster care, and it's good to see that that piece of work has been done to understand that you can be a professional and you can be a parent, and that they are not mutually exclusive, and that actually we swap from the one to the other, either through the placement or from at the beginning, or whatever it may, or on depending on circumstances. So it's really reassuring, certainly for me and many of my colleagues, who regard ourselves as professionals in the workforce.
Thank you. Okay, anyone else? Yes?
Can I ask a kind of an open question with the panel? I mean, as Robert was saying, there has been a lot of good stuff which has happened over the last few years in terms of national policy, you know, around care leavers and education and such like. But are there, you know, obviously we've also talked today about some of the remaining issues that there are, but whether you would think that there were some areas that really leap to the top of your mind as being issues that need to be addressed. You know, if the government was thinking where to move on to next, where they should move.
That's a good and challenging question. Okay, Richard, do you want to start? Or
you know, I've definitely got things to say, but I'll keep it short. One of the things I forgot to mention actually is contact with foster families when they move to other foster families or to adoptions. Now, there's quite traditionally some people's views, and it's held with some people within my authority, is cut it off, don't see them so you can develop a new attachment, which goes totally contrary to attachment theory, which actually you've got to have a secure base and ability to come back in order to develop new attachments. That, I think, has got to be addressed. And secondly, for me, is the virtual head role, which is crucial but not defined well enough, and it could potentially be very, very helpful in bringing people together and changing children's outcomes. But I think it needs to be more defined, and good practice needs to be pulled out, and people need to be told a little bit more.
And you're going to come to the virtual school heads conference.
Yeah, no, I'm interested personally doing some research into it, but I don't.
Well,
no, I'm not. Well, there's such different roles everywhere. Everyone's got very different models.
Okay, I think now is the time. We've got a minister who really does think that we as virtual heads can do something about
Absolutely.
outcomes. It's not a well understood role.
No.
We're not always the most popular
No.
people. So all in one day I may be unpopular with the director, unpopular with the influential head teacher, unpopular with my line manager, unpopular with the corporate parenting manager. Like everybody else, sometimes I'm unpopular with my own staff.
That's not true. But the real centre loves you, Venetia. You're always welcome.
That supervises you.
So I think that we can be of most help to you and everybody else, but at the end of the day, the children, if powerful voices go back to Mr. Timpson and say, this role really must become very, very clearly defined. It's a statutory role. You know, the role of the safeguarding officer, the LARDO, and because as he said, in fact he's one of the 7 statutory roles in the local authority, is incredibly clearly defined and everybody understands it. And not least, I would make much better use of taxpayers' money if everybody was clear about the role.
Yeah.
Because quite often we're putting out our nets on one side, we, you know, come back, catch a crab and have to go back, and we put out our nets on another side, and all that takes a lot of time. And sometimes we go round things quite a few times, and then you just get a change of somebody in a job, and we'll take a giant leap forward.
okay.
So I think that very simple message from all your
Defining
different
your role.
organisations
Yeah.
is, you know, I'm sure I can speak for all virtual heads, is that we see this as a real opportunity to help you help your children's learning. And by that I mean learning in the broadest sense.
Great.
But please make that argument with us.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much. Jane.
In a global sense, I think every day all of us involved should say, when anything happens where you need to make a decision, think, is this child-centred? That's one thing I think would make a huge difference, because quite often the process takes over from the child. And actually really support your foster carers through training, just through phone calls, whatever it is. We need support, because actually once you've all walked out of the door, the child is there, and sometimes we don't know what to do and don't do it right, but we try to.
Okay, thank you. Robert.
2 things. The first is what I said, a real serious investment in the quality of the workforce seems to me critical. Just foster carers and the social workers around them, absolutely critical. And the other...
Do you mean training there? Or
I meant much more than training, but yes,
Yeah.
a framework that sets out what, realistically, what it is we expect foster carers to know and how to develop over a period of time. Just being approved is the beginning of a journey, not the end of a process, that really raises the expectations and expectations about the children's workforce. The government are doing something, but sometimes in practice it can seem that the other pressures for local authorities mean that what's happening at one level is just being driven in other directions at other levels. And the other, which is a sort of you know, which I guess we know about, is if a government can stop the commissioning process just driving prices down inexorably forever, because it never has anywhere else, and it may not manage it for foster care. It was probably okay to drive them down for a bit, but it simply won't go on working. And so when you don't know when you get to the point that it starts to be dangerous until it has become dangerous. We've seen it in every other part of the social care workforce. You know, models of adult care and learning disability care are reaching really unacceptable low standards. The worry is that we're on that trajectory for foster care. So some way, we've got to find a different way to stop that trajectory. And that is really tough, because no one has done it yet. But if we don't do it, it will be very, very difficult.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm going to draw it to a close now, because I want to, obviously, we want to give Julie a chance to sum up the day, since she's the prime organiser of the whole thing. So thank you very much for your contributions, and thank you very much to the panel.
I'm not going to make any attempt to summarise, because together with Lucy and the rest of the planning group, we will put our summary out on the website when people have had a chance to have a look at it, and I hope that will be useful and that you'll carry on and see it as the first step in a dialogue. I want to make a couple of very practical points, which is that Frances's slides are here. If you didn't get one, the evaluation sheet is here. We need this. Even if you don't fill out all the questions, if you could fill out some of them, we need it for the planning of the next sessions. So please do leave it on the tables, and we'll come and collect them. The newsletter, which you'll find outside, there are still a few copies or otherwise on the website, has an interesting comment at the back from a young person, Scott, about what is family. I think it was in this issue, wasn't it? Yeah. And that seems to me to relate quite closely to some of the points that have arisen today about thinking differently about attachment in terms of what the young person might see as family, and helping them to get to grips with necessarily having to shift their perception. And I found that a very insightful piece. I hope you will. It also is the newsletter, just to say again, that Billy produced for us on Takeover Day. The next session of this series is on the 2nd of April in Luton, and we'll be addressing sexual exploitation and identity and various... Do you want to just say something, Jenny, about
Yeah.
Jenny's looking after that session?
Any thoughts that you might have about what might be useful for us to think about in terms of foster caring and sex and sexual relationships? We really welcome for us to each put a note down on evaluation. We're still planning the session, but it's going to be focusing very broadly on some of the anxieties that the word sex creates within adolescence, and how we can, as foster carers, support managing those anxieties, both for ourselves as foster carers, but also for the young people. So very broad, and within that there will be a strand focusing on child sexual exploitation, which is the particular area of expertise of the University of Bedfordshire, but it won't be exclusively on child sexual exploitation.
So that is happening in Luton. We are hosting, together with Oxfordshire County Council, the Virtual School Heads Conference here next door in the college next door on the 21st of March, and I believe there are a few places that might be left if you wish to apply for that, and I hope that you've been able to join us for that. But other people have mentioned today the importance of the connection with education. And I want to just thank again, not only the speakers, who I thought all did brilliantly, particularly to Gunva, who is representing, as well as representing herself as a speaker, but representing our colleague Ingrid Hoyer today, who's one of our partners in this seminar series, but couldn't attend today. And my other partners here, John, Jenny, and Gothenburg, and other colleagues from Bedfordshire who've joined in this venture today. Very, very, very helpful. And also to the 3 people at lunchtime who put up their posters and shared their research with us, because I thought that was extremely interesting and useful. And some of those issues will be picked up again during the subsequent sessions. So if you have ideas about what we should be covering, you've got in the pack the rest of the seminar series as proposed. We can't change all the speakers, but we can take note of what you say needs to be covered and build that in. And we will be we'll welcome any comments on today's session afterwards, as well as any that you can leave with us today. There is tea and coffee outside, and I'm really, really grateful for your participation today. And I hope that you felt, even though the discussion groups were rather short, at least that gives, this is too big a group to have an intensive discussion, at least that gives a chance, I hope, for people to feel that they can get their connections in into the discussion. So thank you very much indeed for your participation. Have I forgotten anything?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, brilliant. All right, well thank you very much indeed, and safe journeys home, and do have a cup of tea before you go.